Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this evening's virtual panel discussion brought to you by the California Association of Healthcare Leaders. My name is Jennifer Connolly, representing the National Office of ACHE, and I'm proud to welcome you to this event. Before we get started, I do just have a couple of housekeeping items. First, for the purpose of noise control, you are all currently muted. If at any point you have questions or comments, please add them to the chat box. This event is being recorded and will be available for viewing in our learning management system within 2 business days of this event. The session is worth 1.5 hours of face-to-face credit. If you complete the entire event this evening, you will receive that credit to your ACHE record within 2 weeks. And we do encourage you to complete the evaluation for this session. I'll be putting the direct link to the evaluation in the chat box so that you can access it. So with that, I am happy to turn the floor over to Darielle Earhart to get us started.
Good evening, everyone. It's so great to have you all here and participating in our Cal event on diversity and inclusion. To get the evening started, housekeeping items, please make sure that your microphones are on mute while the panelists are speaking and the moderator is speaking. Out of the gate, I'd like to start by thanking our platinum sponsors, University of Phoenix, Gurnick Academy, and Aya Healthcare for their continued support of our organization and our events. We are also, as an organization, a sponsor of the Mask Up campaign. And in thinking about the Mask Up campaign, I also want to transition into acknowledging today is the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. So if you all wouldn't mind, I'd like to take about 20 seconds of silence to, in remembrance of his passing. Okay. I also want to take this opportunity to encourage you to submit any questions or conversation pieces into the chat room. I'll be participating in the chat as well and happy to assist and answer any questions throughout the event. And just for acknowledgement, this session is being recorded. So if you do not wish to appear in the recording, please make sure your camera is off. Otherwise, your faces are more than welcome, and it also makes for a more enjoyable interaction and conversation. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Kim Brown-Sims. Kim is a very accomplished executive healthcare leader with 30+ years in the C-suite and in various leadership roles. She is also our Cal past president. Thank you, Kim. And has led, our organization through its century pandemic. What's the word for that? Pandemic every century, and Kim drew the lucky card. Currently, she is the CEO and founder of KBS Leadership Consulting, which is a firm bringing the on-the-ground solutions to corporations willing to rebuild with a future-facing approach. In that role, she is also the vice president of the National Executive Board of Women in Healthcare and a member of the American Nursing Association Public Policy and Award-winning Task Force for Racism in Nursing. So thank you, Kim, for that. And with that, Kim, I'm going to hand it off to you and take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Darielle. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone this evening, discussing this most important topic on gender equity and intersectionality. Our learning objectives today are those up on the screen: understanding the case for greater gender, race, equity, and intersectionality in healthcare leadership. Identify effective strategies for initiating difficult but necessary conversation around gender, race, equity, and intersectionality. Learn innovative approaches and ideas for improving gender and racial equity in healthcare leadership, and enhance your organization's ability to address gender and racial bias and create more inclusive cultures for staff, patients, and other clients. And I can't be more excited to be in this role as I get to introduce these absolutely amazing panelists that we have with us for the conversation this evening. I'm going to kick it off by introducing Gail Capozalo. She is a fellow, obviously, in the American College of Healthcare Executive, retired executive vice president and chief strategy officer for Yale New Haven Health. She is currently the executive director of the Equity Collaborative, a learning organization of large healthcare providers committed to greater gender and racial equity in healthcare leadership to build inclusive and productive organizations. Ms. Capozalo is the past chairman of the American College of Healthcare Executives Board of Governors and was recently presented ACHE's Gold Medal Award, in addition to being one of the authors of the template for tonight's panel. So thank you, Gail, for being here with us today. Next, we have Anna Dapolo Garcia. Anna is an inclusion, diversity, and health equity leader at Stanford Healthcare and is the founder and president of Lean In Latinas. I've had the pleasure of working with Anna on multiple panels, and you are in for a treat. In 2013, she was named as Silicon Valley's Business Journal Woman of Influence and graduated from the Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, HOPE, Leadership Institute program. And in 2015, she became the founder of the Lean In Latinas and was appointed as a regional program leader by leanin.org. Anna was featured in the New York Times for her role in creating Lean In Latinas, which is now a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. Can't wait to hear Anna's comments tonight. So thank you again, Anna. Thank you now, Anna, for being on the panel with us. Tonight, we are also incredibly honored to have with us Denise Liu. She is also a fellow in the American College of Healthcare Executives and a specialist leader for Deloitte Consulting, LLP. Denise is a retired Air Force colonel and currently employed, as I stated, as a healthcare consultant with Deloitte. She's board certified and has over 10 years of experience with Deloitte and 26 years of active duty Air Force experience in healthcare administration. Outside of the firm, Ms. Liu is a past chair of the ACHE's Asian Healthcare Leaders Forum. She serves as a mentor for veterans as well as healthcare administration and health policy students, and she is an active member of the Board of Admissions and Community Affairs Committee of the University Club of Washington, D.C. Denise, let me say thank you for your service to our country, and we're thrilled to have you here representing healthcare consulting and also our incredible armed forces. Thank you for being on the panel tonight. Next, we have the incomparable Juana Batiste Brown. Dr. Brown is the Chief Nursing Officer of Ambulatory Care at UCLA Health, overseeing nursing care at more than 180 ambulatory clinics. As the first ambulatory CNO at UCLA Health, Dr. Batiste has built the foundation for organized ambulatory nursing services through innovation, developing standards of care and policies to support optimal and efficient care delivery in the ambulatory setting. Dr. Batiste is also an adjunct faculty member at the UCLA School of Nursing, teaching organization and system leadership for quality improvement in the doctoral nursing program. I am absolutely honored to have Juana on the panel tonight. She and I worked together on the Racism in Healthcare and Nursing Task Force through the American Nurses Association, California. She's an amazing individual and advocate for equity. So thank you, Juana, for being here today as well. As we begin our conversation about gender equity, we really wanted to jump in with a few statistics to frame our conversation. Next slide, please. Studies that have been put forth through the years, such as this one, which is the Health and Research Educational Trust from 2016, have reported different statistics regarding minority representation in the C-suite within healthcare. So minority representation in healthcare has stayed relatively static in C-suite roles, with the exception of the diversity officer role, which you can see from this slide. The statistics between 2011 and 2015 show the jump in representation in that one role. Next slide, please. When we talk about experience-based succession planning, when we look at these statistics, it reinforces the challenge that we have at achieving equity. In comparing men versus women in C-suite roles, it is notable that men continue to hold the majority in CEO and COO roles, regardless of race and ethnicity, which puts women at a disadvantage and women of color at an even greater disadvantage. Next slide, please. When we look at the talent pipeline for women in executive positions, the information first off that you see on this screen is pre-COVID. So you see that there was a slight increase, the bottom line circled in red, from 2015 to 2020. You can see that there's a slight increase over time in the percent representation of women in executive roles. It has historically trailed men, although there has been slight ground gained. Unfortunately, the mass exodus of women from the workforce due to COVID and the continuing pay gaps, meaning women's male counterparts earn more, so subsequently women exited the workforce in order to care for children and family members at home. This pay gap has eroded the funnel to statistics that were equivalent to those seen in the 1980s. We have lost a large amount of ground. Next slide, please. We would be remiss in addressing gender equity and intersectionality if we didn't bring up the topic that you cannot enter a room as one identity or one part of yourself. To come in and just say, I'm a woman or I am a man does not represent us in whole, in totality. All of our identities work together simultaneously. Our world experience is based on the interplay of the identities within multiple dimensions of societal impression, and that is the definition of intersectionality. With that, I'm going to kick off our panel discussion today. We're going to start, this session is going to be very interactive. So we're going to start with a poll question, which you'll see come up on your screen in just a moment. Please take a moment to answer the question, and then we will review the results. Please note that your answers are anonymous. Okay, Jeremy, can we see the results of the poll, please? So which one of the following is not one of the 5 iterative strategies in a proven journey to transform diversity, equity, and inclusion? The answer is actually plan. As you can see on the screen, the majority lean towards architecture, and we will take a moment to review those steps so that there is some clarity in this definition. So if you'll go to the next slide, please, Jeremy. Thank you very much. So there are 5 iterative stages in a proven journey to transform diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those 5 stages are to aspire, assess, architect, act, and advance. And each one of these elements obviously has steps that you can take. I'm going to briefly describe each one of them before we progress to our first question. So under aspire, it really means to define and commit to a DEI aspiration. So focusing on aligning your vision with your intent to modify based on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Then we have assess, which is to diagnose current DEI practices. One of the best things that you can do to begin the dialogue is just to assess where you are. And there are multiple tools available with an easy search. As a matter of fact, if you go to the Equity Collaborative and or the American Hospital Association's websites, there are additional resources that you can use to assess your current status. Additionally, the Racism in Healthcare and Nursing Toolkit is being released by the American Nurses Association and is a great step towards identifying steps that can be taken based off of your current assessment of where you personally and your organization stand. Architect is to develop the plan. So develop your roadmap and your KPIs. So it kind of lends itself to the plan phase, but it's really considered architecting, the entire plan. And then there's ACT, test and learn with quick win programs, and advance, build on your successes and track progress. This is very much the same as quality improvement projects and plans, leans towards lean theory and application, but it is a proven model from McKinsey and Company. So with that, we're going to jump in to our first question of the night. Next slide, please. So discussion topic number 1, strategic change management. Gail, Denise, I'm going to call on you to answer this question first. What are some effective strategies to initiate discussions at all levels of management about gender equity and intersectionality? Let's start with Gail, and then we'll go to Denise.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kim. This is a really important question, I think, because it goes back to where is your organization going? And I find very often that it's super important to start this discussion at senior management or even the board, because without their buy-in, without their desire to model it, to think about it, to make it a truly a strategic importance to them, make it one of their values, it's difficult to move that throughout the organization. So one of the things to do is to ask your senior management. Everybody's doing rounds now. If you aren't a senior leader, ask where we are on this. It's on the top of everybody's mind. Another thing to think about is look around you. Use that as evidence. My girlfriend just moved to a large organization, very large academic medical center, and she looked around the C-suite and she was the only woman. And it was like, oh no, I moved here in the pandemic. I just assumed I didn't meet everybody. You can imagine what role she has, Kim, but she was the only woman there. So that allowed her to begin the discussion of why. So I think there's many things, but that exploration of why, how does it become a value that we then can assess where we are on?
I absolutely love that. And as Dariel stated in my introduction, I'm a part of Women in Healthcare, which is an affiliate organization to the Equity Collaborative. And in speaking with the president of Women in Healthcare, that was a very similar scenario that occurred for her that caused her to want to launch this organization. She was part of a leadership development program. She was super excited to be, included. She walked into the room and there were 150 people, 5 of whom were women. 5, that's 3% representation as a part of the funnel, the future of leadership. So, in that moment, it was recognized that the future of leadership in healthcare was predominantly male and the funnel was male. And so,
and even if you begin to have women the way we are just beginning now, the women of color, that intersectionality between race and gender is the very, very most difficult thing to address, because whenever you look at whether it's pay, power, influence, when you take women and then you look at women of color, there's significant step downs, especially Black women and Indigenous women. So it's something we need to become very aware of and make our boards responsible for, and make it an important accountability that they think are important.
That is absolutely right on target. And Denise, I would question, for you being in the military sector and now in healthcare consulting, what you're seeing and what your experience has been, and what are some of the strategies that you and your team have employed both in the military and now as a healthcare consultant?
Well, first in the military, I think we're just getting started one example is I know my daughter, when she was applying to the Naval Academy, there was a focused effort for them to see that there was a discrepancy between the diversity among the enlisted and the officer corps. And so they deliberately started doing some targeted recruitment for midshipmen in different areas to recruit people into the Naval Academy so that they reached a better number, a ratio of diverse officers to become a little bit more on the level of the enlisted staff. And that just builds more trust between the different groups, because that was one of the issues that they had. And it's good to know, maybe not so much in racial and ethnic quite yet. It is still a work in progress, but I know that the Naval Academy, it has grown from 20% women in the class that my daughter was in, and now they're about 25%. So it is growing. So there's a lot better ratios. And the other thing about the armed services, it's a great time in the armed services because we have our first African-American Secretary of Defense. And in the Air Force, we have our first African-American Chief of Staff. So there are changes that are happening. No females in those positions yet, but maybe that's something that's going to happen soon. And then on the Deloitte side, I'm happy to say that we spent quite a few years, the last 3 or 4 years at least. I've been lucky to be part of several groups that have focused on diversity and inclusion, and then now transition to diversity, equity, inclusion. We haven't gone into JEDI yet, but
how's it going? Hello.
on the DEI. I'm sorry, there's somebody speaking.
Hi, Quinn. If you're not speaking, would you please mute yourself, McKenna? It appears that your speaker might be on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, on the DEI side, so we just recently, the entire firm required all of its employees to take a mandatory e-training on anti-racism, which was a tremendous investment in our staff. And in addition to that, we have had immersive leadership experiences where we went through the different types of biases that people can experience so that we understand. And it was interesting because people didn't even realize that they had unconscious bias until they went through this and saw that, actually saw that they had biases they weren't even aware that they had. And many of our groups, whether it's peer discussion groups and our affinity groups on different accounts and our communities of practice, we've had a wide variety of discussions, courageous conversations about very challenging subjects, so people can be more aware of some of the things, being honest about what you feel, what's preventing you from being authentic, and what can open the doors to feeling more comfortable in not, being like an imposter in your professional appearance or your personality. We've also had a great deal of speaker presentations. We actually had a Race in America speaker series where we actually had activists and authors and a great deal of other people come in and talk about their experiences to share with people. And the firm also allowed us to expense reading resources, some books that can raise our awareness and our education about race and ethnicity.
That's incredible that the organization is investing to that degree in its employees, and especially healthcare consultants who are going out and influencing change within organizations as well. To the rest of our panelists, are there strategies that your organizations are employing that you're finding particularly effective, and or are you just kind of on the verge of employing some of these strategies to move towards more equity within the workplace?
Yeah, so this is Anna. One strategy comes to mind, and we're in the midst of it, and that is, what is the foundation to even have discussions like this? And years ago, and even now, there are some people who are not comfortable with these types of discussions at all. So we are in the midst of deploying an inclusive leadership workshop on Deloitte's 6 traits of inclusive leadership. And so we're really looking at what is that foundation that we're creating, whether it's on this topic, whether it's on bias, microaggressions. And so that's the strategy we're taking now. We've already had our C-suite leaders go through this workshop. And of course, with COVID, we had to translate the in-person workshop to virtual. So we have video, we have, a live 2-hour session, but it's really predicated on what is that foundation we want to build. So we have these types of conversations about race, these really tough topics. And that's where we're investing our time, at least at this moment.
Kwana, I'm going to ask you, this question comes up frequently along this same line, and that is that we've got these great strategies that we're discussing, but are we actually giving them their due, or are we paying them lip service? Are we creating these Band-Aid kind of patches so that we can say we're doing things, or do you feel like there's an absolute commitment to making sustainable change?
I believe that there is an idea that there is a commitment to sustainable change, but there may not be the strategies to sustain those changes. So I believe, that is what we really focused on with our toolkit, with our Racism in Nursing Task Force. It's building out sustainable change. So now that we can't only go in and say we're going to do a webinar, or we're going to have staff sit through a lecture without giving them some tools and practice, and also checking back in with them to be sure that they understood what they learned, give them the opportunity to practice, and also spread that change across organizations. That's really what is necessary in order to sustain the change that is needed. And in front of that DEI matrix, that started with Aspire, we really need to educate everyone on what's happening. We throw out definitions and terms. Folks don't really know what they mean. And in large groups, or even small groups, folks really won't really say, I'm not comfortable, or I don't understand. We also need to give permission to be in difficult conversations, to be in a safe place, but you have to build a culture that allows that. So I do believe that, some organizations are doing better than others, but that we really need to focus our attention. Also, starting with that C-suite, making it an institutional priority. Not only that this is our webpage for the month, but this is a priority. We're building goals around it, and we're going to hold people accountable for sticking to what we said. This is a year in for George Floyd. Most organizations have a DEI person, but what is that person doing? And do they have the influence, the authority, and the power to move those conversations forward? And I'm not sure that that's happening. So I think that we are on the crust of really having an opportunity for change, but we have to be mindful in the way that we craft this journey moving forward.
Those are brilliant comments. And, honestly, when we're talking
something.
Yes, absolutely.
Can I add something? The Equity Collaborative, which I work with, is 15 large healthcare organizations that are doing what you suggest. The most important thing that they've seen to be able to move forward is 1, adopt metrics, and 2, adopt accountability of the most senior people in that organization tied to those metrics, whether they're process metrics or representative metrics, because we have to change, and we're going to talk about this more. You have to change the structure. You have to change the processes, the policies. That's the only way you get to the cultural change. People can be nice, but they're not honest. And unless you change the way you do hiring, performance performance appraisals, not just the education piece, but what your policy says, those things that we're going to talk about later are what makes the difference in the long run and makes it possible, as opposed to being the flavor of the month, because we've been here before. I mean, we've been here before, but we didn't really make the changes.
Yeah, I love the idea of the metrics and the dashboards, those things that keep it front facing for staff, but also making it up, down, and across all levels so that everyone's accountable, because this is really a change for the entire organization. It's not just individual, but how do we make sure that we hardwire those accountabilities and tie them to organizational and individual goals to be sure that everyone is moving in the same direction?
So that's a beautiful segue into our second poll question, which is, moving us into hiring practices. So Jeremy, thank you for putting the question up on the screen. And here is the poll. Which of the following is not a recommended policy change for DEI recruitment and selection practices? 1 minute. Okay, Jeremy, would you like to display the results, please? 85% said discuss candidates' fit with the organization. Well done. That is absolutely correct. If we go to the next slide, we have some recommendation for do's and don'ts related to recruitment and selection. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'm going to pull out a few key ones. One is, again, not to discuss candidates' fit within an organization, because fit can be interpreted in many different ways. And if the color of their skin or their gender is not male and white, it can be interpreted as discriminatory. Also, don't assume that the selection committee is aware of their own bias. So I believe it was Anna that said that the assessments were being done of individuals within your organization, and that, it might have been Denise, and they were actually very surprised at their own biases, and that there was a lack of awareness of how they, stood in their space. And so assuming that people are aware and have knowledge will not lead us in the direction we need to go. A couple of poignant elements for what you can do. One is to eliminate gender biased language in job descriptions. Really look at your job descriptions and ensure that they're not leaning one way or another. Create blinded CVs. So, this is something that is relatively new on the scene, where CVs come to you with names and any dates of birth or anything related to age or any type of discriminatory qualifier blinded, so that all you're seeing are the skills that are being represented, so that you can make decisions about who to bring forth based off of the skills that they bring to the table. Mm-hmm. The other thing that you can do is to look at structured and individual interviews, moving away from the panel interviews. And lastly, the last element I'll review, although there are multiple on the screen, is to require balanced candidate pools. And that ties us right back into those metrics and targeted efforts towards bringing in individuals of color and obviously different races, ethnicities, and those intersectionality components that we discussed early on. So in order to create sustainable change, Jeremy, next slide, please. How has your organization examined its human resources policies with a gender and race lens to consider changes to support better inclusion of women and people of color? And Anna, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I get to talk about something that either people run away from or run towards when it relates to policies. And, it's just one of those necessary things that we have in the workplace. But actually, what Gail was saying earlier are extremely important. And one of the things that I've sort of taken away from, decades in the workplace and around policies is they really can reflect your organization's culture. Borrowing some of the legal language that you have in these policies. So our goal in the Inclusion, Diversity, and Health Equity Department, which is a fairly new department at Stanford Healthcare, absolutely front and center is that we want to be involved in either reviewing policies, having a seat at the table, really looking at the lens, through the lens of inclusion and diversity. What is that policy's intent? who are the people will be impacted by that policy. So not only would I recommend that we have a DEI type of person or persons at the table, and there are some organizations that don't have that type of personnel. And if you don't, what is the diversity of people looking at those policies? Most recently, we reviewed our personal appearance policy. So as you can probably imagine and know from personal experience, these types of policies are sort of riddled with various ways of interpretation. But shout out to our Pride LGBTQ plus employee resource group who initiated that. So, some of our obvious areas of opportunity was really making sure that our personal appearance policy was gender neutral. I can remember the first time I looked at that policy, I don't know, 20 something years ago. There was very specific references to women wearing hosiery or, men wearing certain things. And so, we're certainly pulling a lot of those pieces out. So we've had enough spirited conversations about this. But, in healthcare, where those areas where we have uniforms, that's fine. But we also have a lot of staff that do not have direct patient care, and a lot of staff, and when you look at the generations who are influenced by what might be happening in high tech, but at the end of the day, are we being inclusive in hearing all voices? Also, I mentioned the Pride and LGBTQ employee resource group. We have 8 employee resource groups, and they're also fairly new, but we're also looking at how can we leverage these groups, whether it's the Latinx group, the Black ERG, we call the Beam Team, or others that we have. And also looking at our recruiting policies. You've already mentioned blind CVs. Absolutely. Is there a vendor that we can work with to implement blind resumes, to minimize bias and equalize the selection process? Lori McKenzie, who's the lead strategist for DE&I at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, brings a lot around public speaking on this topic, and it's very enlightening. And I think it's just the obvious way to go if we really want to eliminate bias. And then other HR policies around race. We have a workplace violence subcommittee, really looking at what are those policies to ensure that our staff are not subjected to racism. And unfortunately, it does happen. We do not have any tolerance for any racist comments, remarks, behaviors towards our person and towards other patients and families. So, those are areas that we can lean into in inclusion, diversity. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just curious how you hold people accountable to those things, because that's a huge conversation that was had within our task force as we were developing the toolkit for addressing racism in nursing and healthcare. Was how do you hold people accountable to changing their practices? And, so I'm very curious how you guys are addressing that.
So when you say people, are you referring to patients, families, patients and families?
Well, patients and families, and also peers, right? Because if a comment is made, there's this this known vortex that report of harassment, discrimination, so on goes into, and you never see the outcome of what the investigation was or revealed.
Yeah, and that's the trick with employee labor relations types of departments. But the threshold that we have now should have been the threshold that any organization should have had for many years back. But there really is a heightened awareness around what we will deem acceptable and not acceptable. From a patient perspective, we do have protocols around maybe referring to a patient to another practitioner or another provider, or maybe sometimes even another healthcare provider. There have been cases like that. As far as staff, well, of course, we invoke the disciplinary process. If there is behavior that is doesn't speak to our values in the organization. So fortunately, we have a department like Employer Labor Relations that will get involved.
Thank you for that. And Denise, I'm curious in the military how people were held accountable and what policy changes you actually started seeing come forth, what those policies looked like.
Well, again, I think the military is just on the cusp of recognizing that there are challenges in with respect to racism and ethnicity. Just based on some of the events that just have occurred in the past year or so, I think that there is a recognition that there are some things that need to be looked at, and I think the leadership is doing that. But one thing that we have to start with is going back to those iterative stages that we talked about earlier. I know at least our firm, first of all, you have to assess where you are. There's always been some demographic reports, but one of the things that we found in Deloitte is that some of this information is masked. You can't ask certain questions, right? In the personnel system, you can't draw out that information. So the first step that we have to do is actually ask people to self-identify with their permission in order to get a better assessment of where we were in our policies. And by doing that, we were able to publish just a few months ago our first diversity, equity, and inclusion transparency report, which looked at what the demographics were, but also get into comparisons between the total workforce against leadership, what's the breakdown by leadership, by gender, by generation, by race and ethnicity, promotion opportunity, and recruiting, all of those areas. And that led to the next step. It's again, going back to those stages that we talked about earlier, establish some goals. And the goals really fell into 4 areas, and 3 of which were focused on HR policies. One was obviously diversity and equity, just looking at, what is the breakdown among our workforce. And then another is inclusion and belonging. What are some of the policies that we have to allow people to feel comfortable in their organizations so they can be, they don't have to hide their identities, and, increase their understanding of some of the concepts that affect your well-being. And that led to also the 3rd area is actually, what is your well-being? How do you feel? Do you feel comfortable? Are there challenges, not because of not necessarily just because of your ethnicity or your background, but what are some of the things that affect you that make you more productive and is stopping you from being the best that you can be? And going back to what Gail was saying about some of the metrics people, some of the organizations have to establish, at least in the diversity and equity arena, the firm actually established goals such as increase the number of Black and Hispanic and Latinx professionals by 50% by 2025. That's very specific. And also increase female representation by 45% by 2025. So really concrete goals on what you want to achieve and measure that to see how we're progressing in and if the policies that we put in place have made a difference.
And to add to that, one of the things that the Equity Collaborative, the 15 healthcare organizations that I'm working with have done is we went through and looked at gold standard policies from a racist lens and a work-life balance lens, because that is so gender discriminatory in this country, is creating that. And one of the biggest areas that affected women, and particularly women of color, was this maternity policy, as opposed to a parental leave policy, or a family leave policy, because the vast majority of our members in healthcare organizations are not at the gold policy level of at least 12 weeks fully paid, both father and mother, and requirement that fathers take this, as well as after that, you either go back half time at your full pay, or you stay off another 6 months at half your pay. Those are the kinds of things that Silicon Valley and other major places are doing around this country. And healthcare, we're not doing that at all. We found that incredibly lacking. Many of our organizations had maternity policies and didn't even speak to the fathers at all. And talking about the inclusiveness, how do you get men? Only by having a culture of belonging and inclusiveness do you get men to take that unless you require it, because they're afraid that they'll go on the mommy track if they take time to care for the kids, even though their statements in the survey show they'd love to spend more time. So I think there's so many policies, and taking, Anna, what you said, taking policy by policy and having your employee resource groups read them and providing input to them, you'll be amazed. You know, it's like Johns Hopkins looking at the fact that they had first-year residents right out of medical school wearing short jackets, white jackets, and everybody else wearing long jackets. That's structural discrimination. Just the uniform policy itself. Why do we have dark colors for people who, or the grays, I mean the browns and the greens for people who clean the room and do the food service, and we always have docs in white and nurses in white or blue? I mean, there's an intuitive nature of unconscious bias in that, and so it takes a lot, I think, to go through these policies and to get that culture. It takes a heck of a lot, I know, but to get the culture where we want it, you have to get those employee resource groups feeling that they contributed to the change.
One thing I'll add. Oh, sorry, Deb.
No, please.
Yeah. One thing I'll add about the employee resource groups, we are leveraging the 4C framework model by Dr. Robert Rodriguez, where the 4 Cs, whether it's work around culture, community, commerce, and I know I'm forgetting one of them, but on the commerce one is, how can these employee resource groups support the business? So you're spot on, Gail, I'm actually excited that we have these groups that can speak from their lived experience and their perspective, about these policies. And like I said before, many of these policies do reflect the culture of the organization and when were they written and who wrote them. And, so you have to really go through that with that lens to say, what was the intent? I see a policy that it started in 1980 something, and the world and gender was treated so differently back then. And, so you have to really pare it down, but it's one of those tasks that you do in an organization. Like I said earlier, you either run away from it or you go to the light.
Right. Think about it. Back then it was women in dresses and no open-toed shoes and no dangling earrings and no facial hair, no tattoos. My God, if we said no tattoos today, we lose half our workforce.
Right.
It's just really different, and we have to acknowledge that.
Right. Yeah. Tattoos and hair color are hot topics. Oh, we don't hear you, Kim.
It might help if I take myself off mute, which you would think that I would, have some cognition around, considering that we're on virtual environments so much these days. But it's a perfect conversation leading us to our next poll question, which is really around checking our own bias and understanding of microaggression, which is how we interact. And these are also things we relate to changing policy, right? So which of the following for our audience out there is not an example of a microaggression that may be seen in the workplace? This question probably causes many people pause. So once again, I'll read the question. Which of the following is not an example of a microaggression that may be seen in the workplace? Jeremy, would you display the results, please? So the interesting thing about this, it was a trick question, is that every single one of these is a representative example of a microaggression. And that really, you were forced to choose one, so I understand. And it's interesting, would you mind coordinating lunch, right? That is incredibly, it puts someone down, right? It's very discriminatory based off of the assumption that you're inferior because you get to, coordinate the lunch. Woohoo! So, it's interesting that we don't really have a clear understanding because of the way we have been socialized all of these years as to what microaggression actually means. So that leads us, thank you, Jeremy, into our next topic of conversation. And it also allows us to take a look at some of the things that companies can do in relation to these microaggressions, and also, again, creating policy around equalizing, how we interact with our employees and how we lead. So the above slide outlines steps that companies can take in their quest for equality. And for the purpose of our conversation today, gender equality, I want you to take note that Black women are disproportionately affected, and that there are ways that we can attempt to eradicate these inequities. One is to become an ally, mentor, and/or advocate, or create these types of programs within your organization, or to you yourself personally take on. So with that, we're going to go into our next discussion topic. Kwana, I'm going to ask you first to address effectively addressing microaggression, which is how might gender diversity and intersectionality principles translate into interactions with our patients, colleagues, and clients?
Thank you, Kim. I'll take myself off mute. I think for this question, it's really important to understand social norms and how we've been socialized and the impact of that on microaggressions towards patients, towards colleagues, and towards clients. I think when you think about microaggressions, they're very brief. They may be conscious or unconscious. And they're really hurtful to the folks who are receiving them, but to the person who's the perpetrator of the microaggression, they may or may not even know that they're doing it. And that's why it's very difficult to be able to eradicate and even address microaggressions. So, gender diversity and intersectionality really bring together all of the bad things in society that equal racism. And we have put a term on it, calling it microaggressions, when it's really unconscious racism. So it is the things that we say to people, oh, I thought you were from the South. Well, that could be really hurtful if I am from the South and you believe that folks from the South are not articulate. So I believe that, it's the intersectionality of not one minority, but multiple minorities coming together, and then that social norm, compiling that into what we see as structural racism, but in daily activities, it's microaggressions, it's micro insults, it's micro invalidations, it's all the things that make someone feel very small, that make them disconnect, that make them feel not included in the conversation. It hurts our workforce, it hurts our productivity, and it hurts us as a society moving forward, because those are all the things that in the past we've tried to hide and now we're trying to address. So I would say that, microaggressions are extremely hurtful, but until we educate everyone on what they are and feel comfortable talking about it, and also equip those who are victims of microaggression with the tools necessary to address them, we won't be able to move forward. Because if someone does a microaggression towards you, you don't even know if that just happened. So often you're left feeling confused. Did that person really mean it? So I think it creates some imbalance and dissonance in the relationship between the aggressor and the person who's experiencing that microaggression.
So frequently you will see the aggression occur between leaders, and specifically if there is a male leader who is above a female leader. A lot of times, I mean, it happens broadly, not just, but many times you see that dynamic occur. And when you're in that power play, how do we address the fact that this microaggression just occurred and that's not okay with me, without fear of retaliation or some type of disciplinary action that is not even related to the conversation that's being had? It happens all too frequently.
Yeah, and thank you, Kim. That's a great point. And I think it's really equipping the person who's experiencing that microaggression with the tools to repeat back what that person just say. What did you mean? Did you really say that? And sometimes framing it in that way is not seen as being aggressive, because you're really just asking a question, but it may allow the person who said it to really question what was meant by what they said, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And if I could add to that, Kim, I think that's yeah, it's, we're a learning organization, obviously, at Stanford, the university, the School of Medicine, and equipping, staff with tools. For example, the School of Medicine recently created an e-module for future clinicians, physician assistants, and to better support the queer community. And really, what does that mean? For example, misgendering or not using a person's proper pronouns or names could be a form of microaggressions. But it's really, what are we doing to equip people with the tools and information? Before we get into a situation of blame, it's what are we doing to help? Because again, for example, I was speaking to a director today, and she was sharing with me. She was like, I was really dismayed that I used the word articulate, and she's a white female. And, and she said, I meant that in a really positive way. I meant that. And I said, I understand. I understand. And she was being very vulnerable with me and being really transparent. I said, but I'm a person of color, and let me share with you how I received that. And so she really was not aware of that being a microaggression, especially against a person of color, and saying that, but she just really had no idea.
I think you're finding that more and more commonly.
I'm sorry, Kim.
Go right ahead, Gail.
I think you're so right, because it's really not about the intention, it's about how the receiver is receiving it. And at Yamahaven, we did, and I find that the other organizations are doing, we did a lot of work on what are microaggressions. What are microaggressions among employees? And particularly for people in power, what are the microaggressions in white people that you're not consciously aware that you're doing? And then created tools for the other person, a couple tools. One is that ouch tool that we all know about. When somebody does a microaggression to you, just to be able to say ouch opens a way to have a dialogue about it. I think the other thing that we talked about is how you help each other in allyship. So if I hear a person of color or a woman from a man experience a microaggression, I can speak up for that person and say, wow, I'm sure you didn't really mean to, for the 15th time, Charlie, to restate what Ann stated. So I'm just being cynical, but you know what I mean. So that there's an allyship of support. And the last thing that in the Equity Collaborative, a number of organizations have started trying to address is patient to employee microaggressions, because they happen so very often, and they're ignored because the patient is always right. And some organizations are having nurses and other caregivers speak to their supervisor about these things and bringing in people to deal with the patients and the patient's family. Because it's not a good place to work if it's okay that a patient continuously has a negative attitude toward you. those are just some suggestions that organizations that I'm aware of are beginning to use.
Yeah, that we have that same situation where something may occur. You know, we could be recognizing those microaggressions, but if it's a client that's exhibiting that, it puts us in an uncomfortable situation, because you really can't criticize a client. But I wanted to mention one thing in the spirit of allyship that you mentioned, Gail. One of the things that our firm had encouraged everyone to do is to put pronouns as part of our signature block. So that and make it comfortable for everyone to do that, so that people get used to using the correct pronouns. And another thing, I'm a fan of certain TV series, and one of them was, there's a little clip in, I don't know how many people watch New Amsterdam, but there was an episode, is in the last season, season 3, episode 6, which was called Why Not Yesterday. There was about a minute and a half clip at about the 38 minute mark, I think, in that episode, that just went through a series of microaggressions that people can display. And I would recommend people try to catch that or try to find that clip. I can put that in the chat too. But I thought it was fantastic.
And, you know, to add to that, I would suggest a book for every white person to read. It's very funny, but it's incredibly powerful, and it's important, even if you haven't experienced doing it, but it's important to understand. And it's written by Amber Ruffin, the comedian, and her actual sister, Lacey Lamar, and it's called You'll Never Believe What Happened to Lacey. And it's a dialogue of incredible microaggressions, macroaggressions that these women experience. And if you listen to, I've read it, and then my girlfriend told me to listen to it on tape because it was even better because of the dialogue, and it's really a great book. I'd recommend it highly.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And we'll put a link to that in the chat as well. The reason we came back to poll question number 3 was that it didn't display for some. So we wanted to put those statements back up for those who didn't get to see the poll question, so that they can have some frame of reference for what we're discussing and how each and every one of these elements is a microaggression.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, you know, I was surprised in the poll that there was 0 for B.
right.
That one really surprised me. I thought, wow, okay. So, you know, so again, it could be for some people that may not be an issue to say something like that, but yeah, for you know, people like my parents or my, you know, family born in Mexico, that, you know, that could generate some feelings of, you know,
Inadequacy, inferiority, right? That's where that comes from. It just like anytime you ask anyone who has an accent, you know, you may be curious about where they were raised, but the impact, people don't understand the impact of the implication of asking that question.
Right.
So
Yeah, and also for the Asian community, you know, we're often thought of as the perpetual foreigner, because you know, I'm 3rd generation. My daughter's 4th generation, and still people ask us where we're from. 4th generation American citizens, and we're still being asked. And the last time I was asked that was actually from a South Asian, so that was even funnier.
well, it's
You know, and I'm a second generation Italian, a first generation Trinidadian, and nobody would ever ask me.
right.
That. You know, it's so ironic. You're so correct.
Well, and the reality is that unless you are American, Indian, Indigenous, we're all foreigners. You know, so it just is amazing to me that based off of the color of our skin, you know, whether we are asked certain questions related to where we come from, because we all come from someplace different, or at least, you know, those our parents or grandparents or great grandparents did, unless you are indigenous. So very interesting. So we're moving into the section of our presentation today that invites the audience to ask questions of our panelists. And so we open those that time for questions up now. Kelly, team, do we have any questions?
So we do not have any questions in the chat, but there was some really great dialogue when Gail and Kwana touched on the importance of metrics. And Kimberly Brown had mentioned one of the metrics that she took with her organization was how many people were completing their unconscious bias. So I thought that was a really great metric, and wondering if there were any other metrics that any of you would recommend as well.
Yeah, in the Equity Collaborative, the metrics we have are twofold. One is representation, because that's easy to measure over time. Within that pipeline that Kim put up, what is the gender, the racial ethnicity mix of that, and to make goals in the future. Another one we use is process metrics. So if you've committed to make a change in a process, the recruitment process, you're going to use it objectively. You're going to insist that the search firms you hire have experience in bringing and having a network of people other than white males for senior positions. And you're changing the way in which you do these things, that you measure what difference it made in the hiring, or how often that's really done. So you're measuring a process as opposed to an outcome, because that's also part of the ability to change the culture over time. One of the things we measure is the promotion rate of women versus men and people of color, especially in medical schools, because it's a much more difficult movement than it is even in health systems. So whatever you're trying to change, whatever systemically you're trying to change, creating metrics around that, the process to make that change can keep you on track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of the same of what Gail is saying for Stanford Healthcare, and really looking at our workforce data. What is our workforce data telling us? Same thing, you know, where do we see the promotions? What does our gender tell us by leadership, by management?
Mm-hmm.
What is that? What is our affirmative action plan telling us? You know, and leveraging that information in a way to bring more transparency to the organization and to to hiring managers. You know what? I think it's really great since the department has been stood up, and again, it's only been a couple of years. There's a lot of people who are really well intended. I've gotten emails from hiring managers to say, I want to have more diversity and help me get there. So there is a really big appetite, but you know, how does that data support what our strategies are going to be?
Well, and the other aspect of it is that, you know, there are community needs assessments that identify the diversity of the community in which, you know, your organization exists. And if you look around and your representative employee and leadership doesn't reflect the diversity within your community, that's a great starting point and something that can be easily measured.
Yeah.
So
and sometimes you don't even need a report. Sometimes you just have to look around. You know, so, you know, there's some of that, but I really feel confident that we're on the right path, and we want to see that, you know, we have a very diverse just by virtue of being in the Bay Area, lots of diversity already here, but, you know, do we see that diversity at all levels is really what we're looking at.
Absolutely. Karina, any additional questions coming forward?
Yes, I just got another one in. It says, besides shedding light on the issue and reviewing current state metrics, What are your diversity, equity, and inclusion groups doing to execute on changes in the gaps you identify?
Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Well, you
I
know,
can-
go ahead.
Please, Anna, go ahead.
No. Yeah, so, you know, in addition to the inclusive leadership workshop, also we're looking at days of understanding. That's sort of a process organizations use. Bringing awareness. We're going to be hosting a cultural Mythbusters panel event, you know, to have conversation around, you know, we're selecting people who are from, you know, the Hispanic community, Asian community, and what are those, you know, what are those myths that people are stereotypes that people have? Let's have a conversation about this. I mean, I'm a long-term Stanford healthcare employee. Prior to what we're doing with inclusion, diversity, we didn't talk about these things. You just got to the work, and let's just not go there. And now the door is wide open. So we're really leveraging that. You know, resources of the month now, anti-racism. I mean, we're just looking at every opportunity where we can have conversations about race, anti-racism, microaggressions. So you know, we're definitely on a fast track in the department.
I find that the equity collaborative organizations across the country are doing a number of things, much like Anna said, but also creating an action plan. So as part of the equity collaborative, we created a bunch of small videos, or found a bunch of small videos, and created questions that leadership could use. And people are holding, and managers are being held accountable to hold these conversations periodically. Because unless you really approach it, and they're very difficult conversations, people are getting training on how to do them, but unless you're willing to approach and ask the question, it doesn't do as well. The other thing that I find many of the organizations are doing are book clubs, the book of the month, book of the month, book of the year, book, not year, but requiring employees as well as managers and leadership to read a book and then go into small groups to discuss the consequences of that. Well, what does it mean to them, and how can the organization talk about these issues differently? I think all of those begins that culture of belonging, and the employee resources groups, I think, help a lot in making people feel that, beginning to feel that vulnerability. And I think one of the major things we're going to have to deal with, even in healthcare, not so much the caregiver, well, two things. One, I think we're going to have to deal with is this hybrid organization. And because we aren't bringing everybody back, I don't know of a healthcare system yet that says we're bringing everybody back. So how does that Zoom connection, and how do you make sure that you're creating a single culture between those not present and those present? And then how do you deal with the conflict between the caregivers that have to be present all the time and those other people that don't? I think all of those things create for people what we're going to have to face as very, very emotional feelings, not just emotional feelings of belonging. And when you think about all the things that we have done differently this year, how do we take the best of that and continue it, but also be aware of those things we haven't talked about?
Wonderful. Kwana, Denise, anything to add?
So for us at UCLA Health today, you know, on the anniversary of George Floyd, actually at 6 p.m., we have a panel discussion about police presence in the healthcare setting. We have done a series of webinars. We've had town hall forums. We have a roadmap for racism, for eradicating racism. But we also have small discussions, you know, journal clubs where groups are getting together. What we found was on the brink of the Black Lives Matter movement in July of last year, lots of individuals wanted to take action. So thankfully, there was positive action, there were protests, but also there were teams that were getting together and they wanted to talk. So we've been leveraging that energy and moving those initiatives forward. At the same time, we have a new EDI chief who is moving together, not only JEDI, but health equity. So we're looking at our health equity and ensuring that not only we're looking at the outcomes, our complexion of our organization, but also at the outcomes and if any disparities and how are we addressing those disparities, specifically related to COVID-19, getting folks vaccinated, what does that look like? And how can we really make an impact to improve health outcomes, understanding that there is health inequity that does exist. The School of Nursing has a real movement. We have a community group where we're looking at the education and the curriculum that we are training our nursing staff, because there is there's a problem with what we have been teaching nurses and being able to understand equitable care. So there's a lot going on here at UCLA Health, but most proudly, I'm very proud that we will be implementing the pilot for the toolkit on eradicating racism in healthcare and nursing, and starting those dialogues, bringing nurses together, making a comfortable space for folks to talk, to do those assessments, and then to hold everyone accountable for moving those forward with those every 3-month check-ins with the different teams. So very proud of that work.
Wonderful. Denise?
And yeah, just a couple things for as far as women are concerned. We have a women's group that just recently recognized women who helped women. So we just put a spotlight on them and encourage other women to help women in the firm. And then as far as people of color, we have targeted mentorship programs where we deliberately assign mentors to those that we're trying to develop, where they are maybe a little bit more disadvantaged in the way that they can move up in the firm. So those are 2 specific things that we're doing to help promote more and increase diversity among the leadership levels across the firm.
Denise, that's such a good example, and I'll give another one that at least 4 of the organizations I'm working with are doing, and that is to focus on sponsorship of people of color, and particularly women of color, and take the mentorship and continue that, but moving it to sponsorship and getting senior people aware who've really got potential, and then getting that ally and sponsorship relationship going so that these people can have a spotlight shown on them and get special jobs that they would not have or get opportunities that they would not have had in the past.
Absolutely. So this is all incredible sharing. And as we kind of come to the close of the conversation, I'd like to invite each of you to kind of leave us with some parting thoughts. And, Anna, you're at the top of my screen, so I'm going to pick on you first.
No, that's perfectly fine. Well, there's so much here, but I've used the word intent a couple of times tonight, and I think that there's just a lot of great intention by a lot of people, and to really lean into that, and sort of looking at the 6 C's for the Deutsch, curiosity, being curious, and with the employee resource groups, it's that opportunity to immerse yourself in the cultures of others and be in, sort of in a learning place. It's okay to say, I don't know, I'd like to know more about that. And some of the tools that we've created at Stanford Healthcare around why saying Black Lives Matter, having conversations that we're seeing with Asian hate crimes. I would say lean in and be brave. Have those brave conversations and say, I don't know. Can you help me? I'd like to understand this more, or whatever this may be. I think it's people are welcoming that now, and I would say take advantage of that.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Denise, you're next in my view.
One thing that I think is very effective that I enjoy personally is just hearing from leaders and telling their stories and making themselves vulnerable, because sometimes we think that the leaders, they're somehow special and they've that you can never be like them. But if you are open and honest and tell about the challenges that you've had and some of the things that you've faced, some of the adversities that you've faced in the past, just being a human being, I found that people just relate to you more when you do make yourself vulnerable. So I think that's one of the things that, when you share and you're able to let people know that you can be successful and encourage people that there is hope and there's future.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Gail, you are next in my view.
I have two things. One is building on what Denise said. I think one of the major leadership traits that we're going to need going forward is humility. Humility to constantly be in a learning situation and say that. But the other thing, I've got gray hair and I've been around a lot, considerably longer than every one of you, but I don't want us to forget this time and stop doing it. I've been through the feminist movement in the 60s. I've been through the civil rights movement in the 60s, and we've made these starts before around equity, and we've always fallen back. This cannot happen. And it's up to every single one of us watching this and many, many more to make sure we really are about equity and we're really about justice. And it has to change. And only if we just keep going is the only way it's going to do it. And we can't forget about it. We can't leave it behind. Nothing can take us off track.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And Kwana.
Hi.
Closing.
Thank you. I believe that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, and that we need to be kind. We need to be authentic, that we need to be able to empathize with each other and to listen, but also to hear. So I think if we lead with kindness, then we will be better together. So I'm truly hopeful for our future. I think that a lot has happened, but we're better together. And I think that collectively, the compassion of healthcare leaders, we can move this forward, not only for healthcare organizations, but for our global family. So I'm very excited for this. This impacts everyone. And so I'm hopeful that we will take what we learned and sustain the changes that are necessary to move us forward into a future where our children and our grandchildren won't have the same experiences that our grandparents had and our fathers and mothers have had. So I'm very hopeful, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to be on this panel. Thank you, Ken. Thanks, everyone.
With that, I'm going to say thank you for your incredible expertise. Thank you for being a shining example of how we can create sustainable change, not only here in the United States, but around the globe. It takes one voice and it takes a community of people with that voice to move us forward and truly, truly make the change that we're talking about. Going backward is not an option. So you'll hear me frequently say, hope is not a plan, it's not a strategy, but it's eternal and essential. Yeah. We have to have a plan, we have to take the steps, and hope is always on top. Yeah. So I hope that you all gained insight from these incredible individuals. I want to thank them again for their expertise and time. And with that, we're going to turn it back over to Darielle for closing comments.
Thank you, Kim. Yes, I would like to take a minute to thank Gail, Denise, Anna, Kwana, and Kim for moderating. Fantastic discussion. It needs to continue on and continue in our workplaces at every level of the organization from the ground up. I know, and it's Kimber, I'm going to call you out, Kimberly. Our organization has been very diligent in this and working on this. And personally, going around and rounding with, our teams and creating a safe space to have these conversations, is extremely important to, help everybody understand, things like unconscious bias or even microaggressions. I think a lot of people just are not familiar with that level of detail and its impact on others, for sure. So thank you for that. Again, I'd like to thank, our sponsors for supporting CAL. These sponsors have also, supported us last year during our pandemic. and have been, steadfast in their support of our activities. Before I go, I do want to encourage you all to share your feedback in the post-event survey. We do look at this feedback and analyze it for improvements. These improvements do help us put on better events as we move forward, especially having transitioned to a virtual environment, and produce the kind of content that's important to you as our members. And lastly, I'm just going to let Jennifer take it away for any final comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Darielle, and thanks everybody. Just a couple of quick items. As Darielle mentioned, we strongly encourage you to complete the evaluation for this session. I've put the link in the chat box, so you can go grab it from there. And the link will also be open for a week, and you can get back to it through your My ACHE page if you need to, by going to the My Online Learning section and selecting Access My Courses. You'll be able to get the evaluation for the next week. In the same location, we'll be posting the recording of this event within 2 business days. If you were with us for the entirety of this event, you'll be seeing your 1.5 hours of face-to-face credit posted to your ACHE record within 2 weeks. And with that, that concludes our session, which is copyrighted in 2021 by the American College of Healthcare Executives, all rights reserved. So thank you everybody for your participation this evening. We really appreciate it, and please stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.